Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I plan to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and opinion. With opinion, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. The From the Spectrum podcast will mostly avoid causes of autism, and I will try to avoid the increase of diagnoses of late. This is like playing tug of war with barbed wire, and I don't think I want to travel down that path. For today's episode, we will parse out the medial prefrontal cortex and common connections and the roles in autism. The medial part of the prefrontal cortex is just a subdivision. The prefrontal is just behind the forehead, extending up and back to about the top of the head. We have discussed the medial prefrontal, and today we will expand on those discussions, expand on the functions, the implications, the metabolic demands, and talk more about some excitation and inhibition imbalance, and mention some familiar genes and proteins and other so-called disorders that share these biological implications. Remember, problems upstream in our biology can have different presentations downstream. For example, problems in the medial prefrontal could cause autism, schizophrenia, OCD, epilepsy, ADHD, etc. There are many variables and variations. We will explore more of these later. For today's episode, we will primarily discuss three areas: the medial prefrontal cortex, the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, or ACC, and the Insula. Just a heads up, we will discuss other regions. This will be a deep discussion into our biology. The goal is seeing how this is entangled with autism. Also, we will cover a couple of scientific papers related to these regions and functions of autism. First, the medial prefrontal cortex. Some basics. The medial prefrontal cortex is 80 to 90% excitatory and 10 to 20% inhibitory. Already, you should see with the excitation inhibition phenomenon of autism how this is a region of interest. The medial prefrontal cortex has the highest resting metabolic rate. Remember the bank account episode. Some genes or proteins involved include the CNTNAP2, SHANK3, and Neuroligin, remember, which is postsynaptic. Neurorexin is presynaptic. Neuroligin is postsynaptic. And PTEN, phosphorus and tensin. The first component covered in episode 3, common genetic and proteins associated with autism. A brief recap and sidebar. We have covered all of those areas previously. But to expand on PTEN's overall goal is regulating cell division. No, cells divide. Remember the discussion on rapamycin, or mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. PTEN regulates cells from growing and dividing too quickly or in an uncontrollable rate. So, cell growth. If you thought about tumors or cancer, that was a correct association. PTEN regulates that. How this is related to autism, that role with tumors or cancer is unclear to me. I have not pursued that data. Only PTEN's role of cells related to development, migration, and so forth. A key function of PTEN, the increased and strengthening of a connection. The medial prefrontal cortex to the basal lateral amygdala. Remember the amygdala from autism and anxiety. The basal lateral is a hotspot for learned anxiety or fear. It is a subdivision of the amygdala, which, remember, is well known for anxiety, fear, some forms of motivation, and social cognition. A side note, oxytocin. We still plan on having an episode on oxytocin and vasopressin because of the roles in social inputs. Oxytocin has long-range projections to the amygdala, the medial prefrontal cortex, and to the basal ganglia, discussed in the first episode. Our go, no-go area is the basal ganglia, which involves the striatum, where motivation and motor movements converge. These long-range projections were just published by Levery et al. In 2024. Also remember the cortico-striatal thalamic loop mentioned in episode 1. This is OCD. And these subdivisions discussed today are deep dives into that loop. Okay, some functions of the medial prefrontal cortex. Cells in the medial have robust responses to motor and sensory cues. We have 3 basic types of cells. Trillions of cells, but essentially there are 3 types. It's amazing. The 3 types are motor, sensory, and interneurons. The medial prefrontal cortex has a role with mentalizing and processing social information about the self and about others in the environment. Briefly, conflict monitoring, error detection, executive control, reward-guided learning, decision-making about risk and reward, adaptive responses. So this is a good item to dissect. 1. A connection from a midline thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is the central area for sensory processing. This connection to the medial prefrontal creates saliency enhancing, or stress is enhancing, whereby when we face fears, when we face threats, face those unwanted or challenging stimuli, this connection equals rewarding arousal, rewarding stress. You have probably heard of fight, flight, or freeze, which describes the sympathetic side of the central nervous system, this side with stress. This connection promotes more fight and not limited to physical fight, is my interpretation, but more of a tenacity, grit, determination role. The Navy SEAL attitude. Normal or adaptive responses. The pathway is the medial prefrontal cortex to the ACC and insula. Discussed later. When we have fear, anxiety, panic, and so forth, the medial prefrontal cortex is controlled by the ACC and insula. Remember the need to lead with the prefrontal. It allows us to understand things so we can properly evaluate things. One of those overall higher order roles of the prefrontal and what makes humans the dominant species on Earth. Adaptive responses also include specialized autonomic or emotional control, as we just discussed, controlling actions, and includes pain perception, and it works downstream with the lateral habenula. Remember that serotonergic area involved in passive versus active coping. That's a few ways of basically explaining the same thing. Adaptive responses. Now, if you're listening to those functions, you can connect autistic phenotypes to all of them. Also, the medial prefrontal cortex works alongside the hypothalamus to mediate homeostatic roles such as hunger, thirst, and autonomic and endocrine functions. Finally, the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in recent memory. Disrupting the medial prefrontal cortex just after a learning bout implicates memory consolidation, or said differently, how or if you remember something. A subarea of the medial, the ventral medial. This is important. Remember the excitation and inhibition balance and the metabolic demands. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex connects to neuromodulatory systems, all of them. Remember episode 5, part 2 of the excitation inhibition balance, and the raphe for serotonin, the ventral tegmental area for dopamine, and remember valence too from the VTA, from autism and anxiety episode. The locus coeruleus for brain adrenaline, epinephrine and or norepinephrine, and the medial or the ventral medial prefrontal cortex connects to acetylcholine, which modulates our focus. In 2022, Hugh and Beyer show the medial prefrontal cortex relies on a delicate balance of those neuromodulatory inputs. Okay, the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, or ACC. The cingulate wraps around. It is entangled around white matter. It's very unique. When blocked or interfered with or shut off, catatonic behaviors follow. And the ACC is involved in dissociative data. Dissociation is when one is completely separate from reality. Catatonic and dissociation are not included in our autism discussion, but worthy of mentioning how powerful the cingulate is to some of these more severe potential behaviors. Some functions of the ACC: motivation, decision making, conflict and error calculating, emotion regulation, pain perception, cognitive control. You can see it helps modulate or help how and where we send our attention. The medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC receives direct inputs from those lower level sensory regions. Essentially, those lower level sensory regions ask the medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC, what should we do and what do we need? This is what's going on in the outside world. What and how should we handle it? The medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC recruits different brain regions based on that information. This is what we're going to do. The medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC lead the way. In addition, the medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC have massive bi-directional connections to those neuromodulator systems and all of the sensory processing systems, so they can be updated and understand what is working, what is not working, and, of course, how to adapt. An interesting and related study shows during passive listening, during dissonance listening, when we are passively just listening to things in the background, the medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC are lit up. They are active during passive listening. In other words, when there's noise going on in the background, the medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC are active and listening. These two regions are always on call, always ready. And now you can see that metabolic demand here as well. And you can see autistics typically prefer being within ourselves. And you can remember me saying the outside world is chaotic. The ACC is hyperactive and hyperconnected with other brain areas under baseline, or said differently, under resting state. And when stimulated, two different scenarios, resting and stimulated. NMDA are involved here. Remember the glutamate receptor. Remember, glutamate is excitation. This area, data show involvement in autism, developmental delay, intellectual disability, epileptic encephalopathy, cephala. Our brains are like and extended versions, several thousand modifications of cephalopods, those less complex creatures living underwater. Also, involvement in ADHD, schizophrenia, and OCD, all things we've discussed. This biology assists with synaptic development and plasticity. So more neuroplasticity, learning, and shaping who we are. A study on theory of mind, which is understanding others based on looking at them, created by Sir Simon Baron-Cohen in 1985, is also called mentalizing or cognitive empathy. These are superdeficits in autism. Duval et al. In 2023 show during a theory of mind task while using neuroimaging autistic subjects had reduced activity in the ACC, the medial prefrontal cortex, and another area, temporal parietal junction. We won't dissect that area. In a second study, we'll discuss from Lee et al. In Molecular Psychiatry from 2024. The ACC shows stronger responses to sensory stimuli, and they can do this on mice. Remember, mice are modeled organisms. They can use foot shocks and whisker stimulation, for example, two good sensory processing tools. The ACC and thalamus and the BNST, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Remember from the Autism and Anxiety episode. And some areas responsible for memory, the hippocampus and the anterior cortex. These areas were hyperactivated. In addition, the study normalized the ACC with chemogenetic, creating a normalized sensory processing sensitivity and normal connection of those areas. In other words, they helped the connection to and from these areas that helped with sensory processing. Okay, we'll discuss the insula and then review a few more studies. The insula was a buzzword in neuroscience since about 12 years ago or so. And later, we'll review a paper by maybe the top scientist on the insula. The insula is a hub, a meeting spot for interpreting bodily responses or bodily states and brain. So things like cognition, thoughts and feelings, and how those are entangled with the current environmental situation. It has three large sources of data: the brain, body, and environment. It receives and processes this data and helps recruit proper responses. Proper responses, or normal responses, is extremely subjective to that person. Defining the insula officially, the insula is central for applying defensive and behavioral strategies, processing bodily states involved in interoception, self-awareness, emotional regulation, consciousness, social anxiety. It connects with cortical and subcortical areas, including being co-activated with the amygdala during fear and anxiety. Now, let's break it down. The anterior insula, discussed more in detail shortly, contains spindle neurons. Spindle neurons are new in mammalian history, and they are only found in humans, bonobos, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. And this was discovered about 25 years ago. Interesting. And a side note, with frontal temporal dementia, these areas that we're discussing today and these spindle neurons are a hot topic. They are a region of interest with this type of dementia. The right anterior insula, a subdivision, coordinates the executive network and the default mode network. These are opposite networks or functioning, depending on if you have a task or if you have no task. Having a task, you recruit the executive functioning skills led by the prefrontal Remember the rule sets, and the prefrontal being a flexible rule setting and execution machine, turning areas and systems on and off, activating and inactivating areas and systems across the entire body. What is needed for that task demand? It's a conductor, or orchestrator, or director, whatever you want to call it. Typically, when nothing is abnormal, typically the executive network and the default mode network do not operate simultaneously. They are anti-correlated. During anxiety or fear, the circuitry can reverse. If someone has maladaptive responses, or that passive coping, or they stay afraid, panicked, so on, the Insula, alongside with the ACC, leads the entire prefrontal cortex, including the medial. Then we lose that so-called executive functioning. Remember, this is crucial reason why humans are the dominant species when we lead with the prefrontal cortex. Okay, let's review some data. Let's go in with a recent one from Neuron, published in 2024 by Fan et al. To start, the dorsal medial area of the prefrontal has a role with mentalizing and representing social information about the self and about others. Fan et al. Found the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC gyrus show neural representations for gaze fixations directed toward the eyes and face of conspecific partner during context-specific neutral eye contact. Okay, so that was a lot, but this has some obvious interest with autism and the eye gaze, and the eye contact. The study shows that these areas are involved here. And last week, a cool paper came out about eye gaze as an infant, improving specificity and sensitivity on later autism assessments. We plan to discuss eye gaze in a future episode. In Fan et al., the question asked is, do these areas contribute to our social attention? Combined with the orbital frontal cortex. Remember, nothing singular is the cause or responsible for any one thing. These areas, the orbital frontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the ACC, have bidirectional connections to the amygdala, a region sharing interest with social cognition. Remember the autism and anxiety episode. Social gaze might be, or could be, critical for observational learning and social decision making. Two huge components with autism. In socialness, gaze timing, adapting with increases or decreases of eye gaze depending on the social context are important. Remember, because social norms and humans say so. This guides social interaction and social learning. And we can think about this as a young child all the way through adulthood and the implications with autism. Okay, the next two studies come from 2009. Interestingly, these are old relative to autism research, but both feature Luciana Uden, one of the foremost researchers and neuroscientists on the Insula. One is a review and one is a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis show hyperactivation in the ACC in social task and non-social task. Important with autism research and important for exploring specific regions of the brain. The social task show a hypoactivation in the perigenual ACC, whereas non-social task is highlighted in the dorsal ACC. Confirming the roles the ACC have in both social task and non-social task. Additionally, the right anterior insula hypoactive during social task. In the autistic group, during non-social task, autistics have greater activation in a completely different area, the rostral ACC, an area typically suppressed in the comparison group. In the review study, there is a suspicion the hypoactive or disconnected region of the insula is a result of projections to and from sensory and limbic areas, thus causing errors in attentional resources and subsequent guiding of adaptive responses in socialness. Sounds familiar. Sounds like autism. Okay, last one. Published in Communications Biology in April of 2024. Sang et al. Studying 6-week-old infants with a high risk of autism, a family history of autism. If we step back for a moment, infants, a primary visual input for them are faces, and specifically, smiling and happy faces. Everyone wants to see the baby smile and or laugh. This study is brilliant, whereby they used 6-week-old infants and studied attentional biases and sensorimotor processing. The high likelihood group, as the study defined, have higher connectivity with sensorimotor regions, whereas typical likelihood have a stronger connectivity to prefrontal regions. And if you think about that critical age that we've discussed, if autism manifests in this critical age where we learn the outside world is chaotic from all of that sensory overload, that age where there is a lot of sensory going on and neuroplasticity going on, is it learned that the outside world is chaotic, and then we learn to withdraw. We learn to avoid. In addition, the higher connected sensorimotor group, the high likelihood group, had lower connections to the prefrontal areas. And this ought to suggest that the prefrontal cortex is not recruited as much or as needed compared to the typicals. As we wrap up today, we covered a lot of biology and a lot of different studies. However, mostly they are all directed towards certain areas of the body or the brain and certain behaviors. I think we funneled this down into a few certain behaviors and causes of autism. I hope you can see that people with autism have these biological implications, and this can help explain our why. This can help you understand autism. If you are listening and enjoy the episode and enjoy the podcast, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge. And I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me, if you wish, at info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. And thank you for listening to From the Spectrum Podcast.